Yeah, if you're internet, are you back in Puerto Rico, Lena? Oh, she can't understand me. Uh, oh no! Oh no! Okay, we just seem to be having network issues in general today. So I hope. Well, I'm seeing Liza and Linnea pretty well, so that's a positive, and I guess some folks can hear me. Yeah, and Maddie continues to have issues with internet, and he can't afford Wi-Fi. Yeah, okay. So yes, so oh God, it's the fall of American civilization, at least for the time being. But everything will be okay. Free Wi-Fi for students. Yeah, I don't know if that's for college students though, but it might be worth checking out certainly. Um, okay, so just again, last time we talked about those kind of 7 dimensions that movement researchers tend to use to predict who's going to participate in the movement, who's more likely to participate in a movement. And again, if you missed any of that, well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, I think, in the textbook, and the recording of that is now up online. The other thing that I think I mentioned, but maybe didn't stress enough, is that those different dimensions are neither, I guess I would say, mutually exclusive or exhaustive. So there's definitely overlap between things like social networks and organizational membership. Obviously, if you're a member of an organization and you make not physical contact, but if you make, sort of personal contacts with other people in that organization, that now constitutes membership in a network. So there's a lot of overlap between things like that. And again, it's not, so that's the lack of mutual exclusivity there to those dimensions. And also, I wouldn't say that that's exhaustive, but it does, I think, come pretty close, at least, in my own readings, that pretty well covers it, and we can talk about the different variations on those things. And we'll see today, particularly with the second article that we read, kind of how, even though she may not use words like biographical availability all the time, or, she only kind of touches on collective identity, clearly those are at play. All right, so these, and having some kind of breakdown of those different dimensions, I think, does give us, at least some boxes to start putting things in, some tools to think about organizations. And as you are crafting your case studies, that I hope gives you something to hang, your hat on. And just a reminder, you've got now, it's the 9th, you got just a little under 3 weeks to complete those case studies. And so do remember to be on that. Okay, so today we'll be talking about who are the radical Islamists, as well as focusing on recruits into the Salvadoran guerrilla army in the 80s and 90s. Again, well, and Eliza and Linnea will be doing those in turn. But again, with these articles, remember, clearly there are important and interesting lessons, in the details, and clearly it's useful to know about radical Islam. At the same time, though, remember, to try to think, in your framing of these, how we can extract some more general lessons about movement participation, movement recruitment, and so on. Eliza, are you ready to do something with Islamists? Yeah? Okay, I'll turn it over to you then.
Okay, so I did the one on radical Islamists. It was a pretty short chapter and it was sort of all over the place. So I did my best. They were all over the place, but it talks about traditional Islamic movements and then Islamist movements. The difference is that the traditional Islamic movements, they looked at the mystical and personal authority, and it didn't use as many educated people. They drew on the less educated, versus the Islamists tried to get a more educated population of people, and they really tried to incorporate modern life into it to make it more applicable to, I guess, modernity. And then it goes on after it talks about that to talk about religious leaders. And so um it talks about bin Laden, and then the Taliban as your traditional one. So most of them were involved in universities, actually, and the Islamist groups. So bin Laden was a civil engineer, and a lot of the top people within that organization, Al Qaeda, were highly educated. Some of them were even teachers, which was really interesting. Um, and a lot of them were recruited from universities in Egypt, which is also interesting. And then it goes on to talk about the tactics of how they would recruit these leaders. So they would get a lot of them from the school system. So either most of them would be secular schools, whether it be university, a high school, or they would reach out to people who had graduated from a university but didn't have any employment, which means that these people were super vulnerable. They were looking to have any sense of belonging. They needed money, they needed something. And then they also looked at, and then the Taliban, they had people that weren't educated. They chose basically anyone who needed a group to go to. And so the growth in the secular education was something that really increased in, like, fed into the Al Qaeda group, because a bunch of these universities were teaching more secular views, which allowed more room for people to question their religion. But since they weren't given a seminary education, which is a religious based education, they didn't have any tools to sort of properly analyze the religious texts. So it allowed them to create these radical views, and then from the radical views, like I said, they're more likely to join a radical group like the radical Islamists. And since they were at this vulnerable stance where they didn't really know what they thought about the religion, they were more likely to cling on to something that sort of helped them guide themselves. And then it talked about sorry, I'm a little unorganized, but and then it talked about how yeah, people were turning against the text and how it allowed them to create the radical views. And then also each state created their own texts and books on Islamic values. So each state had their differing views, and this allowed a lot of room for the state itself to put their opinion on religion into people, which could affect their likeliness of joining a radical group. And it also allowed some sort of Islamic authority. And since there's not any definition of who should be in charge of like an Islamic authority, it allowed people to take their own charge into it, which allowed the leaders for the groups to
Hmm.
create. And then I went on to talk about Islam groups and their relation to modernity. So bin Laden incorporated modern issues like economics and social issues into his practice, and not his practice, into his group. So, like I said, the main difference was traditionalists. They were more disassociated from modern life, and they wanted to return. So the goal of all of this was to return back to a original Islamic state. But the difference was that the traditionals wanted to fit that to a mold, and then the Islamists, they wanted to not fit it to a mold. They wanted to follow those practices and beliefs, but they wanted to adjust them to modern life. So bin Laden, who was the leader of Al Qaeda, which was an Islamist, he, like I said, he focused on issues like economics, and that's what made them really different from the Taliban. And then also, they allowed women to receive education, which was something that Taliban didn't do. So, Al Qaeda and Islamist groups really focused on trying to incorporate modern practices into it. And this was a way to sort of gain a certain following and also, in my opinion, sort of keep the public eye at least semi supporting them, because it didn't appear to be as radical per se, and it seemed to fit in with a lot of it fit in with the times more. And like I said, so they allowed women to have different, have receive an education. So people, like women, were taking up all different kinds of jobs. They were broadcasters, they were lawyers, they were everything. And this also allowed groups to be formed on the views of Islam. So there were a bunch of feminist groups actually, and it called out the Taliban for its lack of feminist views. So that was really interesting. And like I said earlier, Islamists, their desire was to return back to the original practices. And they still had their non-modern practices, but they wanted to keep those, but they did want to alter it for modern. Also, these Islamist groups were ran like businesses or corporations, so there was a lot of money involved with them. There was a lot of coordinating between other organizations. There was offshore money, and they had business partners and all that kind of stuff. And also, the radical Islamists focused on using a lot of modern technology. So we actually could see that in things like 9/11. They use a bunch of different modern technology to be able to execute it. And so that was something that they really focused on, was being in touch with modern technology along with everything else modern. And so another thing was how they would get their members in oftentimes was that they recruited off of personal ties as well. So once you had been sort of drawn into the group, you were alienated from other groups if there was any talk about you being a part of an Islamist group. So you're not able to really work with other people, which left you socially isolated. So then you needed to sort of be a part of that group even more, and you became more reliant on them. And also, they mentioned how a lot of nonprofits who would do really great things, like give money to orphanages or fund education projects for the community, those were things that in those areas were not very valued. So they didn't get a lot of money from people around them, which meant that they had to resort to other areas to receive funding, which left them sometimes resorting to these radical groups because it was something that would fund them. And since these groups did try to at least have the facade of supporting modern day causes and philanthropy, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So that's a hard word. And so they threw people in that. And then I guess one last thing I wanted to talk about, because you said you sort of wanted to focus on the recruitment tactics, and it had a box talking about charismatic leaders and
Hmm.
how these leaders necessarily weren't people who they weren't always the smartest. They didn't have the best views. They might have not had their shit together, for lack of better wording, but they did have this personality that really drew people in, and they also really monopolized on a fragile system. So if there was political unrest, or if people were upset with their government, or things were really stagnant and not a lot of change was happening, these people really could monopolize on that period of time because they had these personalities that really drew people in and attracted them, and then from there they could manipulate them into different things. But the chapter overall, when you think when you would read radical Islamists, you thought we were going to be reading about like a bunch of terrorism and stuff, and it actually didn't say too much bad about the group. It more talked about the organization of it, and when I think a lot of groups like this, when you look at them on paper, they actually don't seem all that bad. So like radical Islamists, like when you read all this, you're like, you know, that doesn't sound too horrible. A lot of their views, you know, they support human rights and all that kind of stuff. It's just people would take this group and their meaning to an extreme and end up doing really radical things for it. Sort of like PETA. They don't sound bad. They don't sound bad in theory, but you know they do some crazy things. So
Till they
yeah,
start throwing blood on people.
yeah. There was only 6 pages, so I could only, or like 7, so there was not a lot to draw from.
Yeah, but no, you did good, and that's an interesting point that you make too about charisma, which I don't really think, you know, within that, you know, those 7 dimensions. Just looking back, I'm like, I don't know if that necessarily, you know. So it's kind of like ideology, but it's really kind of, it's like, who is the person who attracts you know, you or adherents to the group. And I, you know, again, those are kind of, those are stuck in there by the editors. And so I don't think Kurtzman was necessarily thinking in those terms, but you can think of, and I think that's kind of what Kurtzman is suggesting is one of these big differences between the modernist Islamists and the traditional Taliban, is that the Taliban are all about like personal relationships and like the personalities of the leader, and so Mullah Omar like develops this kind of cult of personality, you know, as a charismatic leader, robing himself in the, what was it, the prophet's robes or something, something weird like that. You know, so trying to like really like develop this personality that's tied to Muhammad and these kinds of things, as opposed to the Bin Ladens, who are really much more about you know, being not secular but modern. You're right that he really does, and I you know, we should too look at the context, right? This is in a it's kind of like the magazine for sociologists context, and it's from 2002, right? So it's right after 9/11. So it's a kind of a counterpoint to all this, like, you know, oh, these people are just evil or crazy, or they hate our way of life, and so he is short on that stuff, but he does like mention in passing, like on 79, certain high profile Islamist goals such as corporal punishment, legalized polygyny, automatic male custody in divorce, restrictive garb for women, bans on heresy and apostasy, and basically Sharia law. You know, that's the kind of the bad stuff that we usually talk about, right? And that we kind of we gloss over here. But yeah, you did a good job, right? And in focusing, I think, especially on that, the bit about the secular, or not necessarily even secular, somewhat secular education of Islamists. That these are not, and again, putting it in the context of 2002, you know, or the immediate post 9/11 era. You know, we wanted to see these guys as all just backwards religious fanatics, and that is true. He's fair. He's saying, you know, that's true of the Taliban. Like, they're really backwards guys who did nothing but like go to, I forget what they call them, those the basically, you know, seminaries in Pakistan, and so everything they know is just the Quran, as opposed to, right, bin civil engineer or the 9/11 hijackers, most of whom were really well-educated people. That spins a different I guess gives us a different window into how they become committed to ideology, and what this movement is about. And therefore, in terms of talking about the recruiting, you're not going to appeal to college-educated people by saying, we want to go back to the 9th century. Like, we don't want to go all the way back to the 9th century, right? Maybe if you've been living in Afghanistan and being a goat herder, that's okay for you, and that's where the Taliban took this. But for educated Saudis and Egyptians, they're not all about that, right? They still want electricity. They just want electricity and the ability to like beat their wives if they want to. So that was good. There was one other little point in here that I just wanted to emphasize. And where was, so on page 81, and I don't think we've really addressed this adequately, and I'm not sure we're really going to touch on it again in any of the other readings. And this is like in the second column on 81. Kurzman writes, Islamists face a dilemma that is common to other radical movements of the past century, whether to water down their message to attract popular support or maintain a pure vision and mobilize a relatively small cadre. And he mentions, right, leftist splinter groups in America, in Europe, but I think this is it's a general important point as we look at social movements, and I think it is especially important as we think of the ideological dimensions of recruitment, and maybe something for you to think about and look at, especially over the course of the history of the different groups that you're studying. Do they start out radical and stay radical, or do they start out radical and then become kind of progressively more mainstream? And he's doing this, Kurzman is writing about it in the context of Islamists really aren't that popular, like in that stuff you were saying about like how they try to give money for charities, but they don't really like give enough money that anybody really thinks that Al-Qaeda is great. They don't do well in elections. They really don't enjoy widespread popular support. So one thing they could do would be to kind of maybe ease up on the wife beating a little bit, ease up on the stonings. But the risk you run if you do that is what? Is that you alienate your core, right? So if PETA like decides like, you know what, whaling's okay, right? We want to attract more Japanese adherents, so we're just going to say whaling, we're okay with that. You run the risk then, though, of a bunch of people who were originally at the center of the movement saying, wait a minute, that's not where we came from. So that really is a recruiting issue. But yeah, I think that does mostly cover. Like you say, it's pretty short, pretty straightforward article. Are there any questions? Anything you want to pop into the chat or anybody? Okay, then not seeing anything. Let's keep on moving. So okay, Linnea is popping in there. Okay. Yes, and you did, you got maybe the luck of the...
I got the long one.
You get the long one. Exactly.
Okay.
That's the article. And it's even...
Huh?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Make sure I pick the right window.
Nice.
Okay, can you see it? Good.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Okay, so women's mobilization in the Salvadoran guerrilla army. So for political context, just so what was happening, it said that women's involvement in Latin American revolutions was high just across the board in the 70s and the 80s. And this was generally thought by a lot of people to be a result of having to step into new, more masculine roles, such as the head of households and paid laborers, because of the state repression that was happening. So it was kind of like a next step that a lot of them took to just become revolutionaries. In El Salvador, the Salvadoran state became increasingly repressive and indiscriminate in its actions. So, like, just doing things to everyone, regardless of like whether they were rebelling against the state or not, in the 1980s. And then the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front engaged in a 12-year-long guerrilla war. They were the revolutionary movement. So there's been research on the women's involvement, but the author of this article was like, it's not representative of the women who were actually involved, because most of them were poor and uneducated and from rural areas. And so she wanted to do a study that actually like talked to those women. And so she set out to answer the question using this case study. Basically, if everyone experiences like the same things that are cited as like reasons that people join movements, why do only some people actually respond to it by becoming activists? And so she wanted to find what other factors are at play that have been not talked about. And she talks about how previous like theoretical research tries to find one big cause for like one typical path and just like and puts everyone into that category, which and assumes that activists are homogenous, which isn't true. And then she talks about the value of network analysis, which takes structured social relations into account and contextualizes individual motives, which is like really valuable. But the problem is that it's determinate, so it like then it defines everyone within that one network as someone who would become a participant when that isn't true. Only some people end up participating. So she combines this network analysis with social psychological analysis of identity-based mobilization to provide a fuller picture. So her basically the model that she proposes as an explanation is the net influence of all networks minus the net influence of all biographical barriers equals the probability of high-risk activism. So basically what that's saying is that people will only take high-risk action for a cause if their social context and surroundings that would push them towards it outweigh any limitations from their personal situation. And then the second thing that she proposes is that movement activism, once they're pushed into that activism, combining that with the level of state-sponsored repression that's at play, that is what will lead them to guerrilla activism, which is kind of the next step. So basically, like the more extreme state actions are against vulnerable and innocent people, the more likely people who are already involved in activism will turn to guerrilla activism. So for this study, she interviewed 82 different women who were from 6 different villages in El Salvador. And they were either guerrilla activists, they were collaborators, or they were just non-participants. And then so the dependent variable was wartime participation. Yeah, okay. So then she analyzed their level of network ties, or categorizing it by previous organizational involvement, family ties, or their living environment. Whether they lived in like refugee camps that were sponsored by the revolutionary movement, and then biographical availability, so whether they were mothers, whether they lived in a home with like a complete family with their parents, and then their age when they joined. And then she looked at their situational context, which was basically like the time during the war that they became mobilized. So her results were that she found 3 distinct paths that all the women took to mobilization. So there was a lot of diversity in their responses and their reasons, but she fit them all into these 3 different paths. So the first one is politicized guerrillas, and she writes, politicized guerrillas were pulled into participation because of their strongly held beliefs. So what she found for the network variable was that they were almost all involved in other political or religious groups that led them to their recruitment, and they all had family ties to FMLN before they joined. For biographical, she found an unexpected trend that most of these women were living in homes with either like both their parents or their spouse, and this was previously thought to be a biographical barrier to participation. And this is probably because of family ties, because the people who were living in their house with them were already involved with the movement. And then for situational, almost all of them joined in the early 1980s when repression started to escalate. Okay. For reluctant guerrillas, she says the 14 women classified as reluctant guerrillas were pushed into guerrilla camps because a crisis left them with no other options. So for the network, that was inconsistent, and she said about half of them were involved in networks, but none of them mentioned that as a motivator to join. But for family ties, almost all of them became active when they ended up in a FMLN-sponsored camp looking for a family member who was already there. For biographical, this was also inconsistent, but it was harder for younger childless women in this category to escape guerrilla mobilization. So not all of them were younger and childless, but the ones that were more likely to end up with them. Almost all of them didn't live with their parents. And also, if they were pregnant, they were allowed into the refugee camps instead of being forced to continue to engage in guerrilla warfare with them. So that was like a factor that allowed women to escape from being guerrillas. But then once they weren't pregnant anymore, that went away. Situational, all of them joined when the repression became extreme and they didn't have any networks or resources to escape this crisis in any other way. It became their only option. Oh yeah, and then I have a question. I know it's hard to have a discussion over video chat, so if this doesn't really go anywhere, that's okay. But I was wondering if you guys think of any social movements that might feature any type of reluctant activists, maybe even if it's not an extreme state repression situation where they aren't obviously forced into it, but movements that people might be involved in it because they feel like they don't really have this is their best choice. All right. Okay. Okay. So
it's a good one to think about, though. It is,
yeah.
It is a good question, and we might want to keep that in mind as we look at different movements as we go along. Did you really want to be a civil rights activist, or was it just social pressure or something that pushed you there? So good question.
Okay, so for the last one, recruited guerrillas. So she says that they were already living in a refugee camp or a repopulated community, but they were specifically targeted by recruiters, and they were persuaded to join the movement. So for networks, and she also said that they weren't forced by any situation. That's what made this group unique. And all of them, the most common responses to the question of why did you join, was either the desire to have an adventure or the desire for retribution and to avenge people they knew. So for network, they all lived in a refugee camp or an FMLN supported repopulation community. And she writes, they were frequently exposed to FMLN ideology and subjected to explicit invitations to join the guerrillas. So they were really exposed to just messages that pushed them into it. Biographical, they were all young. They were almost all but one were childless. They all lived in incomplete families, which like they just didn't live with their parents. So basically like they had fewer barriers to participation, like they didn't have family responsibilities that were holding them down. And this is important because it's not just that like this influenced their decision making, but it also made them bigger targets of recruitment tactics. So the people who were in charge of recruitment were like, oh, these women are young, they're childless, they don't have any responsibility, so they're going to be more likely to join. So we're going to hit them with all of our messaging and get them to join. And she calls this external role expectation. Okay. And then situational, they all joined during the latter part of the war. They didn't do it out of fear of violent acts from the government, but they did all join during a period of heightened recruitment. Okay. So yeah, this is talking a little bit more about the external role expectation. This was a really important conclusion that she came to, and one I thought was super interesting. But like the reason that more of these women joined was not just because they thought to themselves like, oh, I don't have any kids, so I have the opportunity to do this. But like the people who were recruiting them were like, oh, she doesn't have any kids, so she's gonna be a better like person to get to join. And this just made me think of a question that maybe this will get more response, but like what are biographical or like other characteristics of people that like signal to us that someone might be prone, like who do we think of when we think of people who are going to be activists? Like are there any like
I feel like it's usually people with money nowadays.
Yeah,
because they have like the leisurely time, and like it's like this is a bad comparison, but they say that a lot of people with eating disorders are usually of wealth because they have the like have the mentality that they can decide whether or not to eat, and I feel like it's similar with social movements.
and that could apply like people who have the time to commit all of their time and money to this, make the decision to maybe, but then also like they are often targeted by organizations, be like, please fund us because we know that you might care about this, but you also have expendable money that you can just throw at issues. So yeah.
I also think that people who are in like transitory periods in their life, so like for us, like moving from college into the workforce, like there's that section of time where like things are unknown. So these kind of groups can like focus in on those people who are in those times of their life to be like, oh, come join us. Like this gives you an option to do X, Y, Z.
Yeah, absolutely. Like capitalize on people's lack of identity or direction. Okay.
I also think kind of like, sorry, in regards
No,
to
you're fine.
the question, the first one you asked,
Yeah.
kind of like cults in a sense that a lot of people aren't necessarily forced into them, but like at that time, maybe they like lost a really significant family member. And so they kind of like gravitate to a group that provides that sense of family, even though they're
definitely
not forced into it.
Yeah, I mean, like cults are a social movement. Not all social movements are cults, but that's definitely an example of, yeah, like targeting people who need somewhere to turn to. Okay, I can skip that question. That basically we already answered this. Okay, so for her conclusions, she concludes about networks because like networks were cited as like important for the reason why people joined social movements before her study. Like this was an established thing. But she concludes that like yes, organizational involvement is important, but it's not as like universal, homogenous across the board as people thought. And also that just in this case, refugee camps were really, really important as sites of mobilization. And for biography, she says it's important. Biographical factors like do change the probability of people joining, but it's a lot more complex than previously thought. And that's because of the external role expectation, because it has two different things are working there. And then she also talks about how repression, like state-sponsored repression as an influence, is incredibly important, but it's also a lot more nebulous than previously understood. So like the levels of state repression throughout the war like changed year by year. They changed who they affected. And so that makes it like a much less stable variable. And also she says that it created a pressing need for participation through imminent threat, which is something we've talked about, and chaos, but it also later like indirectly caused more participation from certain women because of the new networks that were formed due to dislocation. So that's basically because it dislocated people, because it made them refugees, because it made repopulated areas. That indirectly led to more political participation. And then, yeah, her big takeaway is that it showed that there's not one typical path to activism. And ultimately, state-sponsored repression was the cause, and it was a much bigger cause than previous political participation, which was thought as a big indicator. So, yeah, that's all I have. You're muted. There we go.
Yeah, I was muted. Sorry. Yeah, no, it's quite a bit. And did you post that on the forum?
I posted notes really late last night.
Okay. Yeah, just because that'll be.
I'm supposed to do that.
Uh-oh. Let's see if you can do it late. I think I won't be able to like rate you, but you should be able to post them still.
But you just do like a little review.
Me or you?
No, us. Don't we just do like a little summary of everything we found?
Yeah, that'd be good. Or like with Linnea having if you do a set of slides, just
can I
post them up.
I like wrote all my stuff down. Can I just send you pictures?
Could you scan it, and can you have a scanner? Or there's an app now. Do you have a scanning app to make your things into a PDF?
Nope. I can take pictures on my phone.
Okay. Well, just post them to the forum for the day on Moodle.
Yeah.
So
right.
To share, so we can all kind of build that storehouse of knowledge, if you will. And I should. Well, I don't know if I should, but I'll point out. As an article in the American Journal of Sociology, and I don't particularly remember this, but this is around the time when I was on the editorial board there. The thing is, we always push for articles that really, say something new, potentially change the direction of research in an area. And that stuff that you highlighted towards the end there, really is different and important and new. So I mean, everybody should be, kind of focused on, and in distinction to a lot of the stuff we've already been reading, so when you read McAdam, he's very much looking for the typical path to recruitment for Freedom Summer volunteers, for example, or excuse me, even the Kurzman that you were talking about, Eliza, is what's the typical like Bin Laden style Islamist, and she brings up a really important point. Viterna brings up this really important point that there may be several typical paths, and I think she says at one point everybody has different stuff going on. There's rarely going to be a one size fits all explanation for political participation. Although I will say, some of the articles that she references, some of the people, there are places that are, or I guess events that are more radical and one size fits all. She mentions Roger Gould's work, and Gould looked at things like the Paris Commune, which is kind of like, I can't remember if it's exactly the event that was in Les Miserables, but if you've watched Les Miserables, it's a very kind of similar thing. There are some movements like that, or mass political events, that I would say you could use a pretty one-size-fits-all explanation there. It's like these are all people who live in like 4 or 5 neighborhoods in Paris who are facing repression. They're all in such structurally similar positions that figuring out who's a participant or a leader versus a non-participant, may have a real kind of one-size-fits-all explanation. But in general, and I think you might think that the Salvadoran guerrilla movement would be somewhat like that, because you're like, hey, they're all farmers and they're all getting screwed over. But it's nice that she can really tease out that these different groups joined differently and in different ways. Would also like you just to kind of, in terms of reflecting on the dimensions identified by Almeida, note that she's talking about these things in really different ways. So the way that she talks about social psychology generally, that encompasses collective identity, that encompasses beliefs and ideology. And when we talk about social psychology, I mean, we really talk about, we're talking about the way that people view the world or view themselves based on their experience, their social experiences. And that can include aspects of biography or beliefs or collective identity, those kinds of things. Again, though, one could also use those dimensions to sort of tease out, different aspects of these women's experiences from organizational membership to social networks, and so on. Oh, right, and the other, and Lene did a good job kind of hitting it. This point about biography as being a social pressure or an external role expectation. And I think that is the way that Viterna framed it. I mean, that's a really interesting way of looking at biographical availability, different from what we're used to seeing. So we're used to seeing that as again, this really kind of goes back to McAdam, but we're used to seeing that as like not even a push or a pull thing, but it's like it's availability. It's like, are you in the pool? And that's all that it tells us. If you think about it like McAdam was thinking about it for Freedom Summer Kids, you're in the pool, and some folks in the pool, do feel whatever push or have the right social network. Or the right belief system, if you're in this pool of college students, that you'll go down and join Freedom Summer. But when we look at it in Viterna's way, like you were saying, you get this thing where the people in your network or the people in the refugee camp, and it is kind of, I think, hard for us to imagine. Well, I don't know. It's a worthwhile question. The question you posed of, where can we see this? What social movements can we see this in? You might also think about it in terms of the role expectations just generally that people have in life. So you right now are expected to be college students, like based on, for most of you, and as some of us come from working class backgrounds where you might not have that expectation to go to college. But for a lot of Eckerd students, you know, you come from a middle class background, everybody in your family has been to college. Those dimensions say like, oh, yep, you're going to college. It may not even be a thoughtful thing really on your part. You're just like, all right, like the thing to do now is to go to college. You know, clearly it's a much more fraught thing to pick up a Kalashnikov and go into the jungle and march off to people, but you can sort of think about it, I think, in a similar way of like, if you, well, of course, you know, COVID makes all this weird now because you are you are back at home, but in the before times, right, if you were thinking like, you know, what would it be like to be, you know, living in your room at home when you're 18, 19, 20, not going off to college, I assume people would, I don't know if they'd look at you funny, but, you know, you'd get social pressure from your parents. And it's interesting and worthwhile to think about, you know, in the same way, these women in the camps, you know, it's like you're 18, you don't have any kids, like you could, you know, you could pack a gun through the jungle like really well. Why aren't you doing that? You know, so it might feel awkward, you know, or socially painful in a way. And it might be worth, you know, again, going back to some of those other studies, you know, or again, your think about your cases. Are there people who are in kind of structural biographical locations where participation, activism might be an expectation of them? You know, that's a sort of a, and you know, I didn't see McAdam talk about it, and I'm sorry, I just kind of I laser in on that study for some reason. But you could think that, you know, maybe if you're from one of these Unitarian churches or something like that, and you're 18 and you've got friends from that church who are going to Mississippi, your parents and your friends are going to say like, well, why aren't you going? Like, what's wrong with you? Like that might actually be, you know, a real palpable pressure to people. And I thought there was one other thing that I wanted to focus on, but I think that really hit it. And again, Linnea did a good job. Again, and you know, focusing on equations and graphics, I know that can really be helpful for a lot of folks. So focusing on, I think that was like your second or third slide, where the probability of high risk activism is predicted by the influence of networks and biographical barriers, and also, right, so that movement activism plus repression equals guerrilla activism. You know, those are really nice shorthands for thinking about this. And again, in the movement's literature, for whatever reason, folks really like pictures like that. I think I told you the story about not Charles Bidwell. I'm blacking out his name. My old movements teacher, who really like expected us to be able to draw pictures. I don't think that way. Incidentally, you know, I'm happy with words and sometimes math. But you know, you might think for your own purposes, you know, if you want to kind of understand, you know, how somebody moves into a cult or moves into being a vegan or whatever, you know, draw some pictures of the different pools of people and the different processes that they experience. Okay, did I write anything? Okay, wait, hold on. Okay, you did that. You did that. Oh, right, and also, just again with the biographical thing, and social psychology. She's looking at biographical in a more social psychological way than we've seen before. And I think that's important for us to bear in mind. I love everybody's pets. There's so many pets. Love them. All right. Anyway, oh, right. The biography doesn't just mean like, are you in school now? Or, you know, do you have kids, or are you unemployed? It also means like, what kind of shit have you seen? You know, clearly the folks in that last, not the reluctant guerrillas, but the recruited guerrillas, right? You know, they'd seen some shit, right? Like they'd had their village burned down, you know, especially the ones who were seeking retribution. They had lost loved ones. You know, that's biographical in a real way, but not in that same kind of, you know, just purely structural way. I mean, that's stuff that influences people's psychology, their view of the world. That's a different kind of biography that I think, you know, Viterna is, you know, very right to focus upon. Just to look at some of your questions for today, unless you have, you know, and you can always, again, pop in the chat, or I think we're a small enough class you can turn on your mics if you have questions. But right, so Lena asks, considering the large impact caused by geographical factors when it comes to recruitment, how or can media cause a shift in this impact? Can the ability to communicate at a worldwide level affect who can be recruited and therefore impact biographical availability? That's a really good question, and I think probably something that is, well, I mean, I guess not really under-problematized in this, in either of these articles, but that these are both articles that really occur a little too early historically. So, you know, my thinking is compare. Now, there was just a little tiny bit of this in the Al-Qaeda article, right? So, like, they mentioned that bin Laden made videos of himself, but I mean, I'm sorry, it's kind of weird, right? Like, it's kind of weird to think about. But you know, and I mean, I would not, you know, unless you're, you know, strong of stomach or whatever, or really, really interested in radical Islamism, I wouldn't encourage you to go seek out bin Laden videos or anything like that. But you know, and some of them do include some unpleasantries, certainly. But you know, that was a significant part of his recruiting. You know, but back in those days, it had to be much more kind of, you know, through an underground network. It would be nice, and I know there is a little bit of this, but it would be nice if we had a bit more of a really recent study on something like whatever you want to call them, Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, where we know that much of their recruiting was done by the internet. You know, and that's a very different kind of thing. So, right, you know, Lena, you're right to point out, whereas the recruitment, you know, especially for the Salvadoran women, was all about, you know, were you in this village that was displaced and that puts you far back into guerrilla territory, or are you in a refugee camp, you know, where you're getting exposed to radical ideas? You know, we know at least some portion, it may not be the large portion, but it's some portion of ISIS fighters were Europeans, were recruited through Twitter and YouTube channels, that told people, come to Syria and, fight for the caliphate, which, that's hard to imagine for a lot of movements. But again, so on the one hand, I want to say like, that's very different. The internet has changed everything. On the other hand, there have been certain movements that were like that, going back pretty far historically. So you can also look to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in Spain in their civil war in the 1930s, where you got a bunch of American World War I veterans like Ernest Hemingway, who went and fought with the anti-fascist forces there, and did that kind of through the media and through social networks. So they weren't wasn't quite as rapid as ISIS. And again, though, that all points to the importance of messaging and how you frame and how you do the media. Apparently, and again, I would really discourage you from looking up ISIS videos because they are really horrific. But, again, if you're interested, they're out there. They were very media savvy, media conscious, knew how to craft videos and messages that would appeal to a lot of people. And clearly that's going to be, for movements in general, more important than ever in this hyper mediated world. Forget which direction to click because I'm looking again at your questions. So Chloe asks, what is radical? So what do you think? What should the criteria to label somebody radical include? And maybe you can type some ideas into the chat box. So breaking social boundaries. Yeah, that probably is an important part of it, right? So these are things that are outside of like social boundaries, like norms, right? So, I go back to that one little, what did I say that was? 79, right? Legalized polygyny, right? That's not within the social boundaries, right? Or can we think, we often say, I'm sorry, Tiger King is going to be forever in my head now. What distinguishes a radical animal rights person from a from a not radical, from like center, let's say center left animal rights person? Yeah. So what kind of actions can you take to be? Yeah, they have to be extremes, right? So, yeah, and violence, right? And violence, actually, in general, violence is a great way to distinguish radicals, right? Because, again, it kind of goes back to social norms. The assumption of normal political process is that you don't engage in violence to advance your political cause. You engage in public debate, or you engage in the electoral process. And again, even some of the Islamists do that, right? So you can, and then maybe that's the distinction between the radical Islamists and the run-of-the-mill Islamists, is that some of them just participate in political process, as opposed to the terrorism, right? Yeah, and yes, you're probably radical Yeah, at least on a personal level, right? If it does become all encompassing, and yeah, something about the cults came up earlier too. It's right, if you take this to the cult level, right? And again, that's I think about breaking social norms, right? You should be usually you're balanced, and you get beyond those norms, and maybe we start calling you a radical. Chloe also has a good pragmatic kind of terminological question here. What is micro level mobilization, and how is it different from resource mobilization? So micro, again, think to for those of you who have this background, think to your core sociological stuff. Micro is symbolic interaction stuff, is one-on-one interaction, or at the personal level. So when we say micro, really, a way I tend to think about it is people who you could see, as opposed to macro, which is an entire society, or meso, which is the level of institutions. So we could talk about this with respect to the Salvadorans. So micro is at the individual level, up to the small group level. So these families that participate, wasn't that wild? There was like the example of a husband and wife who took their young children with them to be guerrilla warriors. It's like, whoa, that never occurred to me. But of course, that makes some sense. And in terms of micro level mobilization, you're talking about the people who are directly making appeals to individuals. And again, in the Salvadoran article, that gives some pretty good examples, in terms of especially those later recruitments, when somebody from the organization, somebody from the guerrillas would come to you and say, you don't look like you're doing much. Why don't you, take up a gun and get some revenge for your family? That's micro level mobilization. Meso level, we're not talking about it too much, but we generally think of meso level as organizations. So I want to say, was it the FMLA? Was that the abbreviation for? That's such a terrible abbreviation, because it's the same as the Family Leave Act.
I think it's FMLN.
FMLN. Okay, it's a little better. Okay, FMLN would count here. And again, in terms of the visual thing, is like you might be able to sort of see the organization, if they have a big, conference or something like that. But usually this is, above the level of something you can see. And also in the modern era, especially, you'll generally look to bureaucracy. And this is an interesting thing, going back to the Kurzman article. Another way to distinguish groups like the Taliban, and I think ISIL, from groups like Al Qaeda and ISIL, have a bureaucratic structure. That's the stuff that Eliza was talking about with like having like international bank transfers and hierarchies and all that sort of thing. Modern meso-level groups, organizations are organized with that kind of bureaucracy. One of the issues, and at times a strength and a weakness of a group like the Taliban is it tends to remain in this kind of micro level organization around the leader and maybe the warlord's family, right? They're all organized around these personal connections. Modern organizations, though, really don't have that. FMLN, an organized army, absolutely, has a real bureaucratic organization to it. And in fact, if you go into this literature on bureaucracies, armies are almost like the paradigmatic example, the best example, because they're organized so strictly and hierarchically, and there are so many rules that people have to follow. And then in terms of macro, we're talking about states or societies here, things that you're not really going to be able to ever put eyeballs on, these sort of over-encompassing structures that contain so many people in organizations. And Chloe's question also was kind of about the relation of micro mobilization to resource mobilization. And I would say, if we want to locate resource mobilization, that's going to be at the meso level. But, and remember, resource mobilization is going to have to include, for most organizations, at least some level of micro mobilization, at least some recruitment of individuals. But resource mobilization, of course, also includes all that other stuff about fundraising and getting the attention of the media and so on and so forth. Okay. Oh, I wanted to mention too, and I'll write it in the chat, Rena and anybody else, you can turn on closed can you guys turn on closed captions? Okay, yeah. So anybody, if you kind of hover or click on the bottom of your screen there, you do have this option to turn on closed captions, and it's kind of a little spooky to me how well that actually works. They're keeping track of us. They're following our words. And let me just maybe do one more question here. Let's see. We covered that. Oh yeah, Katie brings up an interesting, important kind of point here. So how do radical minority groups like the radical Islamists impact how a larger group of people, such as Muslims, are seen in the eyes of outsiders? So yeah, what do you guys think about that, right? So how do the radicals impact outside perceptions of the less radical, I guess?
Well, for groups or people who don't have a super complex view of them or like exposure to Muslims in general before, then once radical Islam start doing stuff, then that's what's visible to them and that's what they associate with the entire group.
Yeah, right. So it's the radicals, I think, generally, right, are so good at getting press that they tend to be perceived as the main thing, or the regular group, right, to the detriment. And again, Kurtzman's really good about pointing out that even in places like Iran, which we generally perceive as like this this backwards radical Islamic state, the radicals are still a minority. Think too about how that works with other groups, right? So even in our own polity here, people look at the Democratic Party, and some group of them identify Democrats now with Bernie Sanders or with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who are certainly more towards the radical left side of things, right? So they can, I guess the expression is, they suck up all the oxygen, right? They're the ones who do all the breathing, do all the talking rather, and get a lot of attention and become representatives of movements. And maybe strategically speaking, that's a good thing, right? If you have a cause you want to advance, do violate some of the norms, and people will pay attention to you. I should say, I've mentioned it in, I don't think I've mentioned it in here. We tend not to, certainly politically in this country, not to look at violence as a positive thing, as certainly I wouldn't call it a legitimate avenue for social action or for enacting social change, but it is often it's certainly one tactic amongst other tactics to consider when you're looking at social movements, and we certainly see that to some extent it is successful. Certainly only temporarily in the case of Al-Qaeda and ISIL, in other places more successfully. So, the Irish Revolution, was clearly successful. The American Revolution, clearly successful. Even street rioting in the United States in the 1960s, was somewhat successful, important in getting racial reforms enacted in the early 1970s. So I'm not telling you that violence is the answer, but violence for some groups has been at least part of the answer. I think, though, it helps if that goes along with a fairly clear message. Okay. I think that's all we really need to get through for today, unless there are more questions. Give you a second to type if you want to type. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So next week, we'll be turning to, I think we're almost back on schedule here. So on Tuesday, Maddie will talk about student movements, and Eliza, you get to talk about El Salvador. I don't know why we're a little obsessed with El Salvador. I know still sociologists who are writing about El Salvador. I guess it's just a super interesting place. So yeah, we'll be talking more about that, more about recruitment. On Tuesday, you remember not to go to classes tomorrow. It's Good Friday, so you should have the day off. So make the most of whatever you can while you're in isolation. Stay healthy. Have a happy Easter if you're into that sort of thing. And I'll see you on Tuesday. Bye.
Bye.